Newsfirst, NEWSLINE with Faraz Shauketaly.
Well, hello, good day and a warm welcome to NEWSLINE. It's been a momentous few days for the people of Great Britain, who have a new Prime Minister now. A Prime Minister who is determined to take the United Kingdom out of the European Union, out of its partnership with 27 other countries and out of the biggest trading bloc in the world. Today NEWSLINE has travelled all the way to the western part of England to find out all about why Britain is pulling out of the European Union. To get to the bottom of all this, we travelled here at the invitation of our guest. In fact, we are guest today, Sir Hugo Swire. So, Sir Hugo, why is it that the United Kingdom is leaving the European Union?
Well, I think people want to leave for different reasons, really. We had a referendum, and the majority of people voted at that point to come out of the EU, and since that period we have failed to honour the pledge we made to the British people, and that's really the deficit in politics at the moment. We've got to deliver on what the British people actually voted for.
Donald Trump says that Boris Johnson is Britain's Trump. Boris Johnson is a controversial figure, and can we take Boris Johnson seriously in light of the fact that Theresa May conspicuously failed to deliver the exit of Britain?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I don't think we can stand and promote or apologise for anything that Donald Trump may or may not say. But if he means that in Boris Johnson he recognises somebody who he can do business with, and if that translates into an early trade deal, that's obviously very good news for the UK and good news for the US. But your real question is, can Boris actually drive this through in a way Theresa May couldn't? And obviously Theresa May couldn't, and that's why she went. She tried several times, 3 times she tried to get her deal through Parliament. She failed on each and every occasion. And therefore the view, I think, of most of the country now is that you need somebody who was a believer in Brexit, who passionately believes in the future of the United Kingdom outside the EU, and that's Boris Johnson, and he's absolutely determined to take us out by the date of the 31st of October.
So, Sir Hugo, is a referendum democratic? Is that the way to achieve governance?
Well, look, I mean, referenda are not my preferred way of going about politics, but we had a referendum. Don't forget, we'd had one previously, a couple of years before, to settle the issue in Scotland, where the majority of people in that referendum chose to stay, wanted Scotland to remain within the United Kingdom, and that was accepted at the time, although not necessarily by some of the Scot Nats. And so it was decided, the Prime Minister David Cameron thought that the way to lance this boil, this problem which has been bedeviling British politics for the best part of 35, 40 years or more, was actually to offer the British people a choice. Now, you can argue backwards and forwards as to, do the people know what they were being asked at the time? Has it got more complicated? But at the end of the day, they were given their choice. I actually was one of those people who voted to remain in the EU at that point, but I now believe that we should totally deliver on what the British people voted for. Otherwise, it seems to me you undermine the basis of democracy.
Sir Hugo, how well informed were the British public in terms of the referendum? Were they well informed? Were they underinformed?
Well, I think it goes back to your original question, and that is, you know, what were people voting for? And I answered you, I think, by saying a number of voting for a number of different reasons. But if there was one sentiment that underpinned all this, I think it was a feeling that people were fed up with the control they saw coming out of Brussels, a failure to control, if you like, our own destiny. And they want out of that arrangement. They're not hostile towards European countries. That would be plainly ridiculous. We've got 3 million Europeans living here in the UK. Many Brits live on continental Europe. They're not hostile to Europe as a continent, or indeed Europeans and the different nations within Europe, but hostile, I think, to the idea that somehow British sovereignty had been subjugated into this rather unaccountable, amorphous grouping, and they'd had enough of that.
But, Sir Hugo, the number of people who voted, you have, out of a population of approximately 66 million people, you have a voting population of 46 million. And out of that, the people who actually voted to leave, when you take it overall, it's a small figure.
Well, it was the biggest demonstration of democracy I think this country's ever seen, actually, in terms of the amount of people who actually took part in that vote. And I don't think you can retrospectively question. Look, there's an awful lot of people who don't like the result, and an awful lot of people in Parliament, we've seen it, who are determined to stop this actually happening. Even at the 11th hour, they're looking at all kinds of parliamentary protocols and so forth to see how they can block it or how they could revoke what we call Article 50. But at the end of the day, the majority of people who voted in that referendum voted to come out of the EU, and we believe that actually those people, the people who voted, their views should be respected.
But, so Hugo, the people who voted represent a tiny portion of the voting, of the entire voter community, if you like. And therefore, why should a small, tiny portion drive this when, in fact, it is Parliament who should be making the decisions?
Well,
because Parliament is representative of everybody.
Well, indeed, and that would be an argument for never having another referendum, and people like me would be very happy not to see another referendum anytime soon. Yeah. But the fact is, there was no threshold. It wasn't a question of 2/3 of people voting have to have a clear majority one way or the other. It was a straight vote, and rather like our electoral system, first past the post, you know, one vote is enough. Yeah. It was a straight vote. Those were the terms that were decided on. It wasn't meant to be the first of three. And actually, all those people who say, now we know more about the implications of Brexit, and that should be submitted to another vote, a second referendum. What happens if the result in a second referendum were marginally the same, but the other way round? So by a small majority, people wanted to remain. What would all those who had voted twice now to come out of the EU, what would they say? I'll tell you what they say. They say we want a third referendum. And you continue this appallingly painful process right off into the next year or two. That would be terrible for Britain, terrible for the economy, and terrible for inward investment, and worse, terrible for our reputation abroad.
Because you mentioned 2/3, this program is being broadcast in Sri Lanka.
Yeah, country I love and know well.
Thank you. Sri Lanka has a written down constitution.
Indeed.
And in that constitution, when it comes to serious matters affecting the national interest or a matter of national issue, then we have it written down that one needs a 2/3, including a 2/3 in Parliament and then a referendum of the people. So we have that safeguard. Over here, you don't have that 2/3.
No, and we don't have a written constitution here. Our constitution is based on precedent and it evolves. And of course, Sri Lanka, because of its painful recent history, has a series of other challenges. It has a series of other challenges going on, continuing in terms of the reconciliation between the different communities, and also after what was a painful, protracted civil war. It's important that that constitution is safeguarded and people have confidence and in the institutions, and they must be as robust as possible. So I quite understand how Sri Lanka has got there. I'm not saying that the way we go about our democracy in the United Kingdom is a template for the way others do it. I'm just saying it's worked for us, but it's the people who are complaining are the people who don't like the fact that in that referendum, the majority of people voted to come out, so therefore they lost that referendum, and some people are still finding that very difficult to accept. Look at the new leader of the Liberal Democrat Party, Joe Swinson, who was asked as recently as about 10 days ago if, in the event of a second referendum, people still voted to come out, would she at that point accept that? She said no. Well, what does that say for democracy? That basically says someone like that would only accept the answer if the answer concurred with what they believe in and what they want. That's not democracy.
And can we go back to why does Britain want out?
I think Britain wants out because it's very interesting. I'm just reading a very good book, Andrew Roberts' excellent relatively new biography of Churchill. It's very interesting, Churchill on Europe. And Churchill's been misquoted enormously on his views on Europe. What's absolutely certain on reading the evidence is that Churchill wanted in post-war Europe, he wanted Europe to come together, to have some kind of union, but he never saw the United Kingdom being part of that. He always saw the UK standing aside, cooperating with Europe, being good neighbours with Europe, but not being part of a Euro-federalist concentration of power. And I think that's still the prevailing sentiment of the British people. I think we are an island race. We want to trade globally. We don't like some of the restrictions we've had imposed on us by being part of the EU. And critically, if you look at the direction of the EU, you look at the language still of someone like President Macron. He's talking about further integration. He's talking about a pooling of sovereignty. He's talking about a single European army. All these sort of things which we reject. Look, our defence issues depend on our constant at sea nuclear deterrent. We're a member of the UN Security Council. We have very close links with the US, and NATO is our guarantor of the defence of Europe, not the EU.
And in the same sort of light, Britain's economic fortunes have done rather well in all these years. Currently, the British economy is worth just under $3 trillion. Isn't that an indication that you did pretty well out of this very large trading bloc?
Well, I think what is interesting, actually, is how robust the underlying structures of the British economy are proving to be, because you would have thought if we were vulnerable, we would be extremely vulnerable at the moment with all the uncertainty generated by this whole debate about coming out of the EU. But actually, if you look at our inward investment, that's still running very high. If you look at consumer confidence, that's high. Interest rates are very low. We've got the highest levels of employment that we've ever seen since records began. Of course, there are prevailing headwinds which are of concern. There's issues of productivity and so forth. And some would argue that the UK economy is only as strong as it is now because of the weakness of the pound. And so certainly some of those things are true and are also of concern. But actually, if you look at where we are now, how the British economy is performing, and therefore how it can perform once we've settled the Brexit issue and can strike free trade deals around the world, I'm hugely optimistic about the United Kingdom's future.
But actually, in terms of manufacturing, if you look at the cars, for example, the figures are down. So manufacturing is, I think, down by about 0.4. And this is all to do with trying to leave, the uncertainty.
No, I don't agree with that. I don't agree with that. If you look at some of the reasons that some of these car companies are doing less well, it's because they've been slow to make the transference from a petrol engine or diesel engine to electric cars, and that's a transition going on at the moment. And look at Jaguar Land Rover. The government have just provided a whole lot of extra money for JLR, which is doing an amazing things. Look, I mean, up to about 3 or 4 years ago, I don't know what the latest statistics are, more cars were being manufactured in the United Kingdom than in the whole of Italy. Now, if you cast your mind back to the 1960s and 70s, when British cars were an international joke, that's a good thing. So, of course, we need to hang on to these car manufacturers. They're hugely important. But equally, we need to recognise that it's not just due to the uncertainty over Brexit that some of these cars are relocating elsewhere.
But, Sir Hugo, what about the fact that it is quite likely, the way things are currently, that British goods will actually cost more?
Well, that rather depends on if you're talking about a sort of tariff war. Look, I believe in a managed no-deal Brexit. I cannot see it's in the interests of the European economies to persist in WTO terms even for very long. It doesn't suit any of us. We need to strike an early trade deal with the European bloc. Look, the latest Mercedes, you were talking about cars earlier, the latest luxury Mercedes manufactured in Germany, Stuttgart, it was the whole concept of it, the whole financial viability of it was predicated on the UK market. So are you really saying that the Chancellor of Germany is going to punish the UK without punishing the automobile manufacturers of her own country. And what are they going to say to her? At the end of the day, these are democratically elected politicians who have to look after over their shoulder to see what their own domestic economies and manufacturers are saying. And I don't see that it's in anyone's interest to beat up the UK for a protracted period, because tariffs work both ways.
Is it fair to say that Britain is concerned about certain aspects about the free movement of people?
Yes, it has been. I think that was a factor, and certainly not here where we are in the southwest so much, but certainly in the northern heartlands of England and East Anglia, where some communities have seen themselves change very radically over a relatively short period, and that is of concern. And I have to say, I think our whole immigration policy has been a bit mixed up, really, particularly when it comes to accounting for foreign students here. I think that's ridiculous that we account for foreign students here as part of our demographics when we count the population. And I very much welcome the fact that Boris Johnson is saying we're going to move to an Australian-style point system and have the people here we want based on their skills and what they can bring to the United Kingdom. And that, coupled with his generous offer to assimilate, as it were, the existing Europeans, over 3 million Europeans who live and work here, who've made their homes here, sounds to me to be generous and to be right.
Is it fair to say that the British public are concerned about the free movement of people, that there is an almost underlying xenophobia?
No, I don't think it's xenophobia, because, as I say, I mean, Boris Johnson has already offered over 3 million Europeans the right to continue to live and work here. I just think that there's a feeling that immigration has not been controlled. Look, it seems to me any government has a duty to protect its own citizens first and foremost, and there are hundreds of thousands of people in this country. We have no idea where they're from, and we have no idea how they got here, and it seems to me that's negligent on behalf of the government, of successive governments. And I think people want to see a tighter, fairer system. I don't think that's xenophobic. Look, we are an island. We've got the population of this country has expanded hugely. The demand on services, is a very generous place to come to in terms of the social services and the welfare state, and that's been, I think, a magnet, a pull to some. But no one wants to become xenophobic or to put up shutters or to build a wall. That's not the British way of doing things. But I think people in Britain are fair-minded. They want a fair system. They've seen it terribly abused. And I think moving to an Australian-style point system is a fair way forward.
Is it that, or is it that Britain only would like to have the wealthier?
No, I don't think that's true either. And I think, don't forget, you've got a Prime Minister now who is successfully Mayor of London twice, who's always been very liberal, if you like, on these matters, because he recognises that London, which is a metropolitan city, and he recognises that the people making the engine of London turn 24 hours a day are people from all over the world. And that's just not the high-powered merchant bankers and doctors and nurses. That's people prepared to work in the kitchens and so forth of our many restaurants and cafes in the hospitality industry. So you've got somebody who inherently is not xenophobic. I mean, Boris's own ancestry is an exotic mix, which is reflected in many contemporary Britons today.
And what will happen to this immigration policy when you find yourselves being invested in by companies from India, China, and the United States too?
Well, I think any conversation, and I was the minister with responsibility for India in the Foreign Office, and of course Indians are very keen. Every conversation starts with a question about visas and access and so forth, and that's what they want. And it cuts both ways, this. Look, the UK is an open economy. It's a pluralistic, open economy, well-regulated, transparent, and we need people from all over the world to be here. And if we were to become either xenophobic or to become insular, that would be suicidal in terms of the economic success of this country.
So that's what I'm trying to say to you. Is it, you've just said it, you'd welcome Indian corporates and Chinese and even the US, they'll want to bring their own people. And you say that that's true, and we are an accommodating lot. But what about the, let's call them the economically challenged people from, let's say, the Eastern Bloc?
Well, look, we already have certain criteria you have to meet before you can come here. There are certain financial criteria you have to meet, and no one's been complaining about those much. But I would argue it slightly differently. I think that it should be up to the British people to set their own immigration policy. After all, we are a sovereign country, and that seems to be the case. Every country has an immigration policy of one sort or the other, so we should be in a position to sort our own out. But look, this country has an incredible record, going back many, many years, of taking in people fleeing regimes which have been either trying to exterminate their own people. Swathes of Huguenots from France in the 17th century and earlier, large amounts of Jewish people escaping pogroms over in Europe, a huge swathe, Ugandan Asians coming here.
That's right.
And we will continue to do that, and we've taken Syrian refugees. I'd like us to take more Syrian refugees as it happens. But it must be on our terms. It's got to be on our terms.
But no, so Hugo, when talking about the Ugandan Asians and also the people of Hong Kong, at the time, Britain, they changed the type of citizenship. You now have British overseas citizens.
Yes.
So those people can't actually come here and live.
No, you're right. There's a distinction between those who have British passports and those who have the right to reside here, and that was the case in some, but not all, of people in Hong Kong.
Does that sound patently unfair?
No, I think the Hong Kong issue is a whole another issue at the moment, which is causing extreme concern here in the United Kingdom and indeed internationally. But at some point you've got to set a limit. Look, this island is a certain size, and you either have a completely open immigration policy, and there aren't many countries in the world, I think, who have that, or you have to control it, and you have to make it fairer and transparent with no special favour. Huge opportunities and challenges, you see, amongst our Commonwealth cousins, of whom, of course, Sri Lanka is a valued partner.
Indeed.
You know, should there be some of my colleagues argue that there should be a different policy towards those from the Commonwealth.
Isn't that a good, valid argument?
Well, you'll be opening up the possibility of immigration from countries as diverse as Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nigeria, who will have huge amounts of people. So I think it's a lovely idea. Listen, there's no one more passionate about the Commonwealth than me. I was Minister for the Commonwealth for 4.5 years, but I don't think to have an immigration policy tilted towards the Commonwealth, whereas it sounds romantic and rather nice, would in the end be very fair or feasible.
So you are firmly of the opinion that this is nothing to do with xenophobia, but being practical and pragmatic.
I think so, and I think had immigration policy been handled more transparently and fairly over the past 15 or 20 years, we would not be having this discussion. And I think it's the fact, particularly under Labour, when they virtually did have an open door policy, I think we're paying the price for that.
Would it be fair to say that in Britain politicians have failed, whilst business has succeeded immensely?
Well, I mean, that would always be the view of a businessman. And businessmen say the best thing that politicians can do is to keep out of business. And they've got a point. I think you can look at anyone's political career, you can look at any government and actually criticise it. But this government's done some good things. We've radically reduced corporation tax. The Thatcher government, of course, freed up all the state nationalised industries, which Mr Corbyn now wishes to re-nationalise. And you saw the boom in the City of London. And look, at the end of the day, the government is responsible for setting the parameters. It's then for business to get on and operate within those parameters and to generate the wealth we need. And people's standards of living in this country are far, far higher than they've ever been. And that's often forgotten, I think.
But why gamble with all that by leaving Europe?
Well, you're presupposing that leaving the European Union is going to be to our detriment economically. I just don't accept that premise.
Why fix something that isn't broken?
Well, I think most people in this country, or the majority of people who voted, felt that it was broken as far as the UK was concerned. Look, I would have always liked to have had some kind of country membership of the club, as it were, which we didn't take all the rules, and we're already outside mainstream Europe. We don't have Schengen, we don't have the euro, so we're already an awkward customer. And I'm sure we could have, if Merkel had...
But immensely successful.
Yeah, and one of the reasons I voted to remain is because I thought that the EU without the UK would be immeasurably weaker. And I think that's still the case. I mean, you know, if you look at the UK and the moderating influence it had in the corridors of power in Brussels and the kind of stability and common sense it brought to Europe, that was hugely important to the EU. And I think the EU is going to be far, far weaker without the UK. And at the end of the day, who's going to benefit from that?
So Hugo, thank you very much for having invited us. We've actually today, we've been your guests. Usually our guest is our guest, but thank you for inviting us and in beautiful surroundings, much more prettier than our studio, which is under reconstruction. But thank you very much. We've much enjoyed being here and listening to what you have to say. And that's the way it was on Newsline. You can watch this program in two parts. We shall make the announcement both on social media and on our networks, on TV1 and perhaps on Sirius TV 2. And that's the way it was. Take care and God bless.
Newsfirst, Newsline with Faraz Shauketaly.